Hello and welcome to the Cook Memorial Public Library Podcast. I'm your host, Nate Goss. In celebration of Women's History Month, we often like to have our local history librarian, Jenny Berry, onto the podcast to talk about some of the women who have made Libertyville what it is today. We've done a few past episodes about women in Libertyville, which I'm going to link to in our show notes. But for this year, we thought it would be interesting to talk about business, specifically businesses of Libertyville that were owned by women. Jenny Berry has done a lot of extensive research on this topic, and she was happy to come onto the podcast and share some of her findings. So you are in for a treat. This is my conversation with Jenny Berry talking about Libertyville businesses owned by women in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Enjoy. All right, Jenny Berry, welcome back to the podcast once again for another local history segment. Today you want to talk a little bit about what work for women looked like in Libertyville?
Yeah, so, I always thought, women's rights, women business owners, that's a very kind of mid-century, late 20th century type of thing, right?
Yeah.
But in the research that I've done, or at least in questions that I've been asked and come across newspaper articles, there were lots of, maybe not lots, that's a little strong, there were several women proprietors, even in the 19th century. And so I wanted to look a little more into that and find out who were these women, what were they doing? Was that normal that they were working and earning money, or was that out of the ordinary?
Yeah. You're talking a lot of 19th century research that you've been doing.
Right.
Why don't we just talk about maybe what, generally speaking, what did work and home look like, maybe around this area, around that time that you're talking about?
Sure. Well, there are several historians that have looked into women's work in the 19th century. And a couple of the terms that you hear tossed around in that literature are the separate spheres, which means that men and women had separate spheres. The women's place was in the home, generally, and men then were in the public. So in general, you weren't seeing women out in the public earning money, doing social things. They could be at home and they could practice. The other phrase that shows up a lot is the cult of domesticity.
A cult of domesticity. Okay.
Basically, a woman should be focusing her energy on keeping a home, child rearing, and providing spiritual guidance. In history of women's work in the Midwest, some of the historians argue that it was a little bit broader in the Midwest because they had come out here. They were pioneering. They were able to create goods at home for barter and sale. That might bring some income to the family. But I'm really interested in is not so much the women just working and making money, but those that actually owned their own businesses.
Okay, so a little beyond just doing work, but more owning, business owning, running businesses, things like that.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. The time period I'm really looking at is 1850 to early 1900s. That's really when you actually see women starting to kind of come into their own. It seems like 100 years maybe earlier than we would think, but a lot of it had to do with the Civil War. So the men went off to war. The women had to keep a family business running. Or they might have to take an income because their husband is gone, so they're doing sewing, washing, taking in boarders just to make ends meet. They also, I didn't think about this until I came across it, men went off to war, which means they weren't going to university. So universities need to take in women to fill the spots left by the men. So now women are getting additional educational opportunities. And also, they're leading aid societies during the Civil War as well. So they're going to want to keep doing some of that stuff when people come back from the war. We think about that with Rosie the Riveter in World War II, but it was happening.
It was a Civil War thing
earlier.
As well. Yeah. Interesting.
Definitely. Now, Illinois was actually, I feel, kind of progressive. So the state was formed in 1818. In 1819, there was actually an act regarding divorce, allowing women to divorce. Additional grounds for divorce were added in 1825. There was a Married Women's Property Acts in 1861 and 1869, which permitted women to own their own property. And in 1872, Illinois passed the first law in the United States prohibiting female discrimination in employment.
Oh, that's a long time ago.
Yeah. Now, I don't know the exact wording of that act, but the concept seems, again, amazingly early in my mind for that.
So, and I'm just curious, so bringing up these laws about divorce, what does marriage and divorce, how does that relate to ideas about women working, women ownership, things like that? Why do we kind of put those two together?
Well, so there were married women that worked and married women that owned businesses. But if you were divorced, you probably had to come up with your own income. So that's going to lead you to work. If you were single, never married, that would be another reason why you would need to work and then perhaps own their own businesses. So the fact that women were able to get divorced means that they're out there and would have to be making their own money.
Right, yeah. It presents different family situations.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, that didn't mean they could just go out and, like, do anything, right? Okay. So we are talking about a limited kind of sphere, even in this public sphere. Basically, the acceptable occupations for women at that time were seen as an extension of their domestic skills. So if they were good at needlework, that might lead to being a milliner, a hat maker, or a dressmaker. If they were good at cooking and hospitality, maybe they're going to run a boarding house or a hotel or a restaurant. Photography, music, art, those were considered within the women's sphere. So if you could monetize those, you were still acting as a woman should, basically.
Yeah.
And we see examples of each of those in Libertyville during this time period as well.
All right. Well, then, hey, why don't we dig into Libertyville a little bit? So you've kind of broken it down into these socially acceptable fields for women to work in. So what was that looking like in Libertyville?
Sure. So we definitely had women who were milliners. In fact, the two women that really kind of set me on this research were Martha Protein and Caroline Hurlbut. And I will say that is her last name. We have a Hurlburt Street. That is a misspelling or maybe a nice spelling. I'm not sure, but it is Hurlbut.
Okay.
And what interests me about them is that they were in business about the same time and almost next door to each other on Milwaukee Avenue.
Competitors, maybe?
They would have been competitors, contemporaries and competitors, which actually also opens up the how many hats did you need?
Right. So I don't think we hear this term that often these days. Millinery, that's hat making.
It is hat making.
Okay.
Yeah. And that was one of the big businesses for women at this time. And not only would they own them, but then people could apprentice into them as well. So it was a real source of work for women. And there actually are Illinois state directories, and we can see that in the 1864-65 directory, there was already women-run millineries in Libertyville. So that's pretty early. But Mrs. Hurlbut and Mrs. Protein were basically in the 1880s. And Mrs. Hurlbut started her life as Caroline Carfield. She was born in 1852. And she married Henry Hurlbut, there even I made this slip, in 1871. And then they moved to Libertyville and bought a building and an existing millinery business from a Mr. and Mrs. M.H. Seavey. And Mrs. Hurlbut was in business until 1908 when poor health forced her retirement. Mrs. Protein was born in Libertyville. She married Francis Protein, who was a tinsmith. And in 1874, she operated her millinery business next to his hardware store and tin shop. She ran her business for almost 30 years. The other thing we see with these women is not only are they running their own businesses, but they're also very socially active. So Mrs. Protein was a member of the Libertyville Women's Club, the Rebecca Lodge, the Royal Neighbors, and the Mystic Workers, all community organizations. So that's a couple examples of milliners.
All right, so that's two hat shops at least in Libertyville at that time. How about some of the other types of businesses that women were operating in Libertyville?
Sure. So I mentioned cooking and hospitality leading to boarding houses and hotels, especially hotels. We can find women running them, even if they're not exactly called out as running them, and I'll explain that in a second. So the earliest example we have is actually Anna Maria Crane. Anna Maria Crane was actually the first woman, or actually first person, as far as I can tell, to be granted a tavern license in 1839 when Lake County was formed. So a tavern, we think of that as a drinking establishment today, but at that time a tavern would have been a drinking establishment as well, but would also have to offer rooms to people.
Sure, yeah.
For that. So she ran that for a while. After that, there was the Grove Hotel or Grove House a little bit later. There was a woman there named Amelia Fisher who ran that for a while. She was actually the daughter of Eli Penniman, who had run the Grove Hotel for many years, but she married into the Fisher family. What's interesting is that in the 1880 census, her husband is listed as hotel keeper, but Amelia is actually listed as landlady. Oftentimes, you'll see in the census that the man is hotel keeper, and then the woman is listed as nothing.
So even though
that's not the case.
You know they're running the show.
Yeah.
But it gets to be the man's business.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So this is kind of unusual to see her actually listed out
in
as
this
a
case,
landlady.
Yeah.
The Grove House went through several different names. This was actually a 3-story hotel on Milwaukee Avenue that was located where the Proctor Building is today. And the Proctor Building is the building on the east side of Milwaukee Avenue that has currently the gelato shop in it and some other businesses.
Yeah. The people staying here, are these mostly like people visiting family, or are they on business?
Sure. They seem to be, at least in the 1880 census. Now, we don't have any sign-in books or anything like that from the hotel, so all we have are notices in the newspaper and looking at the census in certain, in 10-year groups, right? So in the 1880 census, it seemed to be mostly people who were local, and this was almost their permanent address.
Oh, okay.
For that.
Yeah.
And actually, if someone wants more information on that, I just recently did a presentation on Libertyville hotels, which was recorded for the Historical Society, and it's on the Historical Society's YouTube channel.
Okay.
And I go actually into more detail about some of the guests that were at that hotel.
Well, hey, we'll link to it in our show notes, so you guys, listeners can dig in a little bit more into what these hotels looked like.
Exactly. Yeah. And that also goes into the other woman I wanted to mention was Ava Mae Spoor. So the hotel was called the Grove House, then the Fisher House. And then at one point, it was actually called Hotel Spoor after the woman who ran it. This is Ava Mae Spoor. She only ran it for about a year. But the Historical Society has business cards and little like meal tickets and things from from her hotel. That's also, you can see pictures of those in that same recording I just mentioned. Again, most of the time, women weren't even listed as being involved. And here, she actually had her name on the door, which is pretty impressive to me. The other person I want to mention sort of in this hospitality area is someone who ran a restaurant. Now, it's a little tricky to find out exactly who she was because she always said in the advertisement was C. Hardin. It was not unusual for women not to use their first names, maybe as an attempt so people didn't know it was a woman or not a woman. But the reason I wanted to bring her up is because there was an article in the newspaper. They had a bunch of businessmen profiles, and she was the only woman listed there. Here's the quote. It was once popularly believed that no woman can successfully conduct a mercantile business of any magnitude. A complete contradiction of this idea is observed in the prosperous business conducted by Miss C. Hardin of Libertyville. I love that.
So, shattering all sorts of preconceived notions about
Glass
what
ceiling,
women can and can't do.
Yeah.
In Libertyville.
Exactly. So I don't know much more about her. Again, the problem is with not knowing her first name. It's never printed anywhere. But that's, a real problem trying to find out information about women, especially when you don't know their first names. And the other person I'm looking into right now is Clara Spring. She had a restaurant as well, opened about 1905 and was in business for over 20 years in what today is the building that has Main Street Social in it and Crusulis. It was originally built as called the Buckley Building. Okay,
so it's like all these little spots right in that downtown Libertyville area that, historically women business owners of those places.
Most definitely, yeah.
All right, so we've got the milliners, we've got the hotel and barkeeps or tavern keepers. What else do we got for Libertyville business proprietors and owners?
Sure. So the last category that I mentioned earlier was in the photography, music, and art area because fine art was in the women's sphere. This is slightly later. This is around the turn of the century. So there was a woman named Flora Colby who was a photographer. And I mentioned the Bulkley Building. So when that building opened up, she was one of the first tenants in that building, and she had her own photography studio. But we know she closed it by the end of the year, even though the newspaper said she had been favored with a good patronage, but desires to pursue another branch of the business. We know she took a job with the photography business in Kokomo, Indiana in January 1903.
Really? Okay.
She seems to be back in Libertyville a little bit later. But there's little blurbs in the newspaper saying she's visiting, she's living in Chicago. It's just unclear exactly where she went. As far as I can tell, she never married, and she ended up moving to Los Angeles. But I don't know if after that one stint as a photographer here in Kokomo, if that's what she continued to do, or if she went into some other area.
It's interesting because it's almost like you have to put yourself back in time because, we're so used to just snapping photos with our cameras and if it was or with our phones, and before that we've had within my lifetime there's always been point and shoot cameras.
Right.
So to go back to that time, you would have had to have had someone in your town just to take photos, right? To do
definitely.
Your family portrait, individual portraits.
Yeah, and there were she wasn't the first photographer, she wasn't the last photographer. Sure. Because at that time, some people might know of the Brownie camera, which is sort of a box camera. That was kind of one of the first portable personal cameras. That was fairly new at that time. So there would not have been a lot of people who had their own camera equipment. So you would have had to go into a studio to have your picture taken.
Yeah.
And the last person I wanted to bring up, and just briefly, is Ida Cook Strong, who is the daughter of Ansel B. Cook. And I bring her up because we have the Cook Library, the Cook House, whatever.
Ansel B. Cook. You ever heard of him?
Yeah, exactly. You know that guy? So she had actually studied at Lake Geneva Seminary, which at that time was a high school finishing type school in Lake Geneva. And we brought up divorce earlier on. She and her husband, Dr. Albert Bliss Strong, divorced in 1896. And as early as 1898, you can find in the paper advertisements for her vocal studio in Waukegan. She taught voice development, culture, and expression given particular attention. And she continued to teach music when she moved out to California about 1900. So there's another instance where the woman has to go and make some money. And she goes into a field in which she's must have some skill and a talent.
Must have been a decent singer.
Right.
Or at least knew how to make someone a decent singer.
Exactly. Yeah. So we've seen in the people we've looked at, we've seen the people who are married. We had the Mrs. Hurlbut and Mrs. Protein were married and running their own shops. We have people who were married and helping out basically in the family business, the hotel business. We had women who were not married. Or married. Mrs. Spring and Miss Hardin were both who were running restaurants. And then we've got examples of divorce and single women who never married. So kind of a full range of examples in Libertyville of women in different situations needing to own businesses and make some money. And there's many more women out there. I mean, part of the problem of identifying these people is going back to the first names, right? So if you're just looking at newspapers and looking for advertisements, you can't tell if it's a woman or a man oftentimes. In the census, the way that the census tracked things, you really didn't get women and men's occupations split out until the late 1800s. Depending on what the definition was given to the census taker, someone had to be gainfully employed. If a woman is working with her husband in a hotel, does that count as gainfully employed? Some people might say yes, some people not. So there's really finding these women, first identifying them at all is hard. And then trying to find out more about them is even harder because women just didn't leave the same traces as men did in that time period.
Yeah, well, it sounds like even with just the research you have been able to do, uncovering these does certainly give us maybe a different idea of what some of these businesses looked like in Libertyville, that some of them were owned by women, and maybe we wouldn't have expected that for that time period.
Exactly.
All right, well, that's definitely some really interesting stories and interesting people that we've just encountered through this episode. So thank you so much, Jenny, for once again coming on the podcast and sharing, a lot of the research you've been doing lately in Libertyville.
Sure, and if there's anybody out there who knows of other women-owned businesses, I'll start a list.
So throughout the episode, you kind of, dropped in some hints about the types of sources you look at, census data, that kind of stuff, articles. If someone is kind of doing they're on their own hunt of research or different topic they're looking for Libertyville, what kind of resources does the library have that they can, tap into here?
Sure. Well, some of these women we've already started to collect things on. So we may have a local history file for them. So from the local history page, you can bring up that subject file. There's 900 some topics.
That's the local history page on our website.
Exactly.
We'll have it linked in the show notes as well.
Yep. And beyond that, the census is available in Ancestry.com, which is available in-house. If you come into the library, you can use it. Our local papers are on newspapers.com, and not just the Libertyville papers, but the Waukegan papers as well, which would often pick up Libertyville information. Ancestry.com also has city directories as well. It's another way to try and identify people. And then it's just a lot of trial and error, needle in a haystack searching.
But you can spend all the time you need doing that here at the library.
We have the resources. You just have to have the time.
That sounds good. All right. Well, Jenny, thank you so much again for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks.
All right. Thanks for listening to the podcast and for joining us. I always love it when Jenny shares those local history stories with us. If you'd like to dig into any of the resources that Jenny recommended, you can do so by visiting our website. That website is www.cooklib.org. And while you're on that website, make sure you swing by our blog, Shelf Life. That's where we share book recommendations, genealogy tips, other local history stories, and so much more. You can visit that blog directly by going to shelflife.cooklib.org. And we'd love to hear from you. So if you'd like to talk to us about the podcast, if you have any questions or show ideas or anything else, you can talk to us on Twitter at Cook Library, or you can email us at webmaster@cooklib.org. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with others and let them know that they can listen to this episode, along with any past or future episodes of the Cook Memorial Public Library podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they like to get their podcasts. This episode of the Cook Memorial Public Library podcast was recorded in Digital Studio 1 at the Cook Park Library in downtown Libertyville. Visit the Digital Studio page on the library's website to learn more about how you can use the studio spaces at either of our libraries. That's going to wrap it up for the podcast today. We'll be back soon, but until then, keep reading, keep watching, and keep listening.